Good evening. I'd like to, we'll call to order the Town of Essex Select Board meeting for Monday, July 19, 2021.
I will call the Village of Essex Junction Board of Trustees for Monday, July 19th, 2021 to order.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to invite you to stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. I guess a couple of things is the audio. There is no audio in the room, so I just want to remind board members and staff to speak loudly and clearly so folks can hear. Also, same goes to those who are in attendance in the meeting if they want to speak, address the boards. Okay, next agenda item is additions or changes. Are there any additions or changes from staff?
Nothing from staff.
Anything from either board? Do we, Andrew, we had talked about...
Yeah, so the discussion, the 6D, the evaluation of public official, was that from you, Evan, or was that... Nope. So we've got nothing on that, so...
Okay, are you?
So no need.
You're done.
I didn't do my homework.
Okay.
So
okay.
No need.
So no need for D.
So then we would strike the 6D and then also 9B.
Correct.
Okay, can I have a motion from the select board to amend the agenda?
I'm just making sure I can say this correctly because I've been having trouble with the words. I move to approve the agenda as amended.
Second.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Don, for the second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion passes 5-0.
Trustees?
Yes, I move to approve the agenda as amended.
I'll second.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, George. Trustees, any further discussion on that? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Pass 5-0.
Okay, Andrew, take it away.
And that will bring us into public to be heard. So this is a portion of tonight's meeting. If you wish to address the boards about something that is not on the agenda, now is the time to do so. Please anticipate only being able to speak once, and please keep your comments brief. If it's going a little long, I may cut you off, so be prepared for that. We will start with Microsoft Teams, and then we'll bring it back into the room. So for those of you on Microsoft Teams, if you'd wish to speak to something or speak to the boards about something not on the agenda, please go ahead, raise your hand, or type into the chat feature. I'll be sure to give you the floor. Okay, Irene, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you
Yes.
fine.
Thanks. I was thinking a lot about this question as to why merger didn't pass, because that was one proposed topic at a future public forum. For those who don't recall, we just had a 3-year process in which village elected officials devised a plan for merger, and half the residents of the town, that is the residents outside the village, had very little, if any, say in what that plan looked like. That is, it was a proposal for taxation without representation. Now that we've gotten out of the way why it didn't pass, I'd like to propose that we talk about in the public forums why we're still talking about merger after 70 years. If there's something that the town and the village need to resolve, I would hope that we would delve deep and find out what that is and stop proposing merger and start proposing different ways of getting along better, of taxing better, of representing better, or whatever it is that the citizenry over all of these decades has been so frustrated in trying to do, but that merger has never been the answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Irene. I'm not seeing any other hands up on Microsoft Teams. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So we will go ahead and come off from Microsoft Teams. I would just want to say that a little bit of what was said was a fair amount of opinion in terms of people not having a say. There were ample opportunities, both in meetings, outside of meetings, on this board as members outside the village are on the select board. We've rehashed this numerous times, so I'm not sure why it comes up. So for those in the room, anybody wish to speak to the boards about something not on the agenda? Go first, and then bring it to Mike.
No.
It rained today, so I had time to research. I'm Patty Davis, 9 Hillside Circle, and I just think this is really interesting for everybody because being new to this town only 5 years, it's way more complicated than Colchester. It's big. So I want to share the latest GIS map of total traveled highways, excluding class 4 roads and legal trails, because if you guys go to maps.vtrans.vermont.gov, you will find the most updated traveled roads by Jonathan Corliss, or I forget his name, but he's very interesting, who mapped out as of June 30th, 2021, an Essex Center urban compact map within the town of Essex map. So we have the town of Essex, we have the village of Essex Junction, but within the town of Essex, I urge you to look at this map. They went through the up-to-date mileage as of February 10th, 2021, but the chief purpose of these maps, I know, they are just to document classification and mileage of our town highways for purposes of calculating payment to towns for state aid, for town highway maintenance, So I'm speaking on behalf of, I'm hoping that the select board, after last meeting, was very good about listening to its constituents. And I just want to share with you, after researching these facts, that your constituency has continually, over the years, Andrews, just so you know, identified problems of unsafe, unplowed sidewalks and walkways during winter. They've gathered signatures. One of my clients told me this whole story. They gathered signatures in 2003 on Pomfret Road, Thistle Lane, Fox Run, the borders of, I think where the mobile station is, and then it goes into the junction. There's a line somewhere there, I'm not sure. And basically, with no avail. They had signatures and this was 2003. My friend, who's lived here since 1949, had to jump into the snowbank on Alderbrook, which is a circle below me, to avoid being hit by a speeding garbage truck due to no plowed sidewalk to walk on. The safety, health, and welfare of our elders, our senior citizens in the town outside the village, using a cane to walk on our sidewalks, demand action from our select board members that we elected, our municipality. During Tracy Delphia's campaign, a friend of mine who lived here since a long time, and I walked along Alan Martin to stab some signs into the ground. We had Zoe with us with her "Vote Tracy" on her belly, but sign. But we stabbed signs, and we saw this woman trying to walk across with one of those 3-pronged canes where there was a yellow blinking light. It's like across from Blodgett's, I think. And she got stuck in her snowbank with her 3-pronged cane. We had to help her out of the snowbank because she walked along the crosswalk thinking on the other side of the crosswalk, the road would be plowed, the sidewalk would be plowed. Unless there is public support sharing services from all stakeholders, including this new area I told you about, the urban core of Essex Urban Center Core Compact, it's called.
Patty,
Do not sign any agreement,
minute.
please, because policies are just based upon a consulting process that respects the constitutional rights of individuals. Thank you. Those are all facts.
thank you. Mike,
Mike Sullivan, soon to be not a member of the town of Essex. You guys aren't here to talk about merger. The village is not talking about merger. We're not merging. So that's that.
Greg.
I've heard a couple of times merge now, and Mike, I don't know if yours comments were in reference to the forums that are coming up as well. Those are not about merger. I just want to clarify for all of you here and anybody at home, the point of those forums.
first prior.
Okay. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that. Thank you.
go ahead, Ken.
And Signorello. When the complaint about representation is made, what it means is that here we have 10 individuals, 5 of which represent a constituency in the village, the other 5 of which represent an entire town, which includes that same constituency. The complaint basically is that the folks who would be left behind in this separation scenario are saying they would like some representation similar to what the trustees have. That's to try to make it clear. Thank you.
See nobody else in the room, so I think it's safe to say we're done with public comment. And so going on to the first business item, number 6A. Are you gonna take this?
Yes.
So just to be clear, I asked Pat to cover this topic, so I'm from the select board standpoint and passing the gavel to Pat.
Thank you very much, Andy. Business item 6A, we are going to consider approval of the joint resolution in support of the Essex Westford School District's equity policy. For background information, those who aren't aware, the school district recently embarked on I think probably a very sensitive topic surrounding the addition of an equity policy. Certainly in the community, they received a lot of voices at their board meetings, voicing various support, and the town as well as the village have made specific efforts to try to increase our awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the local government level. Evan or Greg, did you have anything specific that you wanted to talk about before we dove into what we hope will be a joint resolution of support for the district's policy from our side of things?
My only comment is that the Essex Westford School District is a district that covers the entire village and town. They are responsible for the education of the children of this community. They did this project. They took on a lot of hearings, and it is appropriate for these boards to weigh in on whether you want to support that policy.
And remind me, Evan, as well, I do believe that we have some members of the school district who are on our internal committee as well.
Yes.
Great. Comments from the boards? Tracy?
Just because the policy itself wasn't included in the agenda, could we put up a link or actually show it on the screen just so folks know what we're talking about and can see it?
We can make that happen. Greg?
Give me a moment while I do that.
Thank you.
While Greg's getting that up, does anyone else on the board have comments or anything they'd like to add to the discussion?
Pat, I just have a question that, maybe I missed it. Maybe you said it and went right over my head. But so I know that our own equity work that we're doing on the municipal side, how does that align with the school? And is it pretty well lined up, everything? Or Is there something different about it?
I don't think there's a number of similarities. I think, at least in regards to the end goal, which is bringing more inclusion and diversity into our staff, the administration.
Okay.
The school district's doing the same thing.
Okay.
Obviously theirs is much more detailed about the students in particular. There's a substantial, there's much more diversity within the student population than obviously there is within, the town and city's employment. So they have a lot of focus on that portion of things. But I think overall, I think they align pretty well from a value standpoint.
I think if you don't mind, the other thing is they're starting to use equity and inclusion in their decision making. And so we would look, again, I think there's a similarity here to what we're working on as well. And I don't want to make this just about race. It could be socioeconomics as well. We have neighborhoods that are socioeconomically different than others. And I think as part of our work and our evaluations, we should also take a look at how it affects people of other socioeconomics than how a policy affects them. So there would be a similarity.
Thank you.
All right, and Greg, you have that up for our audience at home as well?
Tracy found it, so thank you. Yes.
Great.
Hopefully everyone can see it now.
It's in the chat as well.
Okay. If there's no other additions from anyone on the board, we will open it up to public comment. Oh no, I have not read the resolution yet. Looks like we have Irene.
Thanks, Pat. I understand that many of us may be supporters of the equity policy that EWSD has put out. However, last I knew, there's a pretty big bright line between the work the schools do in town and the work that the municipalities do in town. I thought we were doing our own inclusive policy development, and I'm not sure why, no matter how good friends we are with folks on the school board and how much we support what they're doing, why on earth, when the select board and trustees have so many other things on their plate and potentially on their plate, that we would spend time talking about school policies. And I don't think this sets a good precedent for the future. When we have a merger or separation or other municipal policy on the table, I don't expect people from the school board to officially weigh in on it. And conversely, I don't expect the select board and trustees to be weighing in on an equity policy that's quite oriented toward the educational process here in the town and village and in Westford. So I'd respectfully request that we remember where we are, remember what our jurisdictions are, and not have these things show up on the agenda, because that puts everyone in a very awkward spot, because now we want to honor the fact that school board members are on the call, and we want to honor whoever decided to put it on the agenda. And it's kind of embarrassing if you don't now affirm it, because it looks like you don't approve of equity. And that's not my point at all. My point is, let's remember what our jurisdiction is. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Irene. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No? Okay. Then we will bring things back to the board. And as Dawn very politely reminded me, the resolution itself typically is read by our clerk. So, Tracy, would you mind reading the resolution before we
Not at all.
move to a vote?
Joint resolution in support of the Essex Westford School District Equity Policy. whereas the Essex Westford School District, EWSD, recently worked with the school district and community to develop a policy to create equity in EWSD, and whereas EWSD adopted an equity policy, C29, on June 15th, 2021, and whereas the town of Essex and village of Essex Junction have committed to being a community that embraces equity and is more welcoming to all people, and whereas the town of Essex and the village of Essex Junction partner with EWSD to better serve the community. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Essex Junction Board of Trustees and Town of Essex Select Board fully support the Essex Westford School District Equity Policy that was adopted on June 15th, 2021.
Thank you, Tracy. Last call. Boards, anyone have anything they'd like to add? Okay.
Yes.
That's it.
Sorry, Pat.
No, absolutely. Raj, please go ahead.
I just want to say I'm grateful to the folks at DWSD, community members, faculty, staff, students for the work they've done on this. They set a great example, and I'm just grateful for the work they've done, and grateful that the board feels like it can do two things in one night. I'm sure we can handle both.
Thank you, Raj. Okay. Then this time, at least for the select board, I will entertain a motion to Andy. Did I see your hand go up?
I just took my glasses off, but I'll go ahead and, yeah. I move that the select board approve the joint resolution in support of the Essex Westford School District Equity Policy.
Second.
Great. Goes by Andy, second Don. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 5-0.
Trustees, similar motion?
Move the trustees approve the joint resolution in support of the Essex Westford School District Equity Policy.
I'll second.
Thank you, Dan and George. Trustees, any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Passed 5-0. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that will bring us to item 6B, to discuss the Essex Junction Independence Initiative to separate from the town of Essex. So as we start this, one of the things I'd like to do as well is just go over the process as to how we're going to do this. First and foremost, this is the first time that our two boards have had this kind of a conversation. And so as such, we're kind of building the plane as you fly, if we will. And along those lines, we ask for your forgiveness as it may be messy at times. So please be patient with us as we go through this. Also, this is the first time that the select board has had a meeting since they've seen our proposal. So they have yet to actually talk about this among themselves. So I ask that we all keep that in mind. And that these are proposals. These are not contracts. These are not things our two boards have formally agreed to. So I ask for everybody to keep that in mind, that our two boards have not agreed to the items that are outlined within these proposals. So the way this is going to work is I will provide an overview of one proposal, or I'll go through one proposal. From there, our boards will have a bit of a time to talk amongst ourselves, both sides to ask some questions as we try and come to some form of common language. When that conversation has concluded, we will go on to the next proposal. At some point, the boards may feel as if we have talked more than what our brains will allow us to continue discussing, and or we might just be getting kind of late. And if it comes to that point, we may end this process before we've gone through everything, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. And public comment, we are looking to have that at the very end of going through all of these proposals and at the end of our conversations tonight. So I ask for your patience as we do that. Anything you wanted to cover that I didn't cover in that?
No, I think you got it.
So, first and foremost is police. As we go through these proposals, you will notice after the topic, we have trustee priority. So with each of these proposals, except for one, the trustees did rank in order of priority, 1 being highest priority, 11 being the lowest, how much of a priority they are to us. And then they are ordered in our packets along those lines. So police is, as you will see, trustee priority number 1. One proposal we did not rank, that came in a little bit after the fact, and so that's at the end of this, at the end of our conversation. So with the police proposal, you can see the important components to us, that when we talk about a contract for police services, we are talking about the police department, the community justice center, dispatch, and the building. We would acknowledge the continued payment of the bond, that we would share future maintenance and repairs through the budget, that future bonding would have to be passed by both communities, that the City of Essex Junction manager would have influence and input on hiring and relevant police policies. We would look to create an advisory oversight board with 3 city and 3 town representatives appointed by the respective boards, and that the board would be staffed by city and town managers. Police direct expenses would be shared based on percentage of the grand list. Work of equity and inclusion group input is incorporated into the oversight board, and since that work is not yet done, we weren't quite sure how to word it at this point, but just we wanted to make sure that it would be worked into whatever their findings are at the end. That the City Council and the Select Board will work to align ordinances as best as we possibly can, especially in the feedback we've heard from the police department recently. That all police, community justice, and dispatch revenues and grants are shared and can only be used for these shared activities. And that there would be no expiration to this contract, but instead there would be a 5-year notice of termination clause by either party. And the rationale is that both communities would be better served by continuing to be served by one police department as compared to separating police services and having the city create its own. Up to select board members or trustees for that matter, but
Can I add something, Andrew? And I want to make sure, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we also acknowledged and I thought would be in here now that I'm reading it, is I think we did acknowledge that the police chief would have to answer to one manager, and that would be the town manager. That we would not presume that the police chief in a council manager government would have 2 bosses. So the police chief, ultimately whoever is the town manager would be, since it would still continue to be a town department, the town manager, the chief would be under the supervision of the town manager.
Correct.
That's correct, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Select board members, any questions, comments? Good, Pat.
I appreciate that clarification, George. I think in particular, Chief Hogue has mentioned that, it's critical that they have a very clear sort of chain of command, as it were. What did you see, not you in particular, just trustees in general, what did you see as the city manager has influence and input on hiring? Like, how exactly do you see that process kind of playing out if the chief reports to the town manager? Just kind of want to get an idea for.
I'm happy to answer, but I think maybe Andrew probably can answer just as well. And do you want to have that?
Sure. So essentially, there would be a conversation between the 2 managers. That it would be similar to how before we had Evan. We had Pat. So really, that it would be a conversation between the 2 managers. That it would be something that, even though the town manager does hire, does ultimately supervise the police chief, that there would at least be a conversation and an opportunity for the 2 to converse on that.
John, go ahead.
Well, following along with Pat, my next one is, what would be the purpose of the oversight board? What do you see it doing or not doing?
In terms of like what their purview would be.
Yeah.
So some of this was in a way the equity and inclusion group, as we've heard that there's exploration into having an oversight. And as a part of that, we wanted to ensure that that was a part of this proposal, as that was the one of the things I think that had come out from the equity group that we knew was coming down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to add a little bit more to that. I mean, right now uh, the the group that's working with the police chief, we've talked a little bit about an advisory oversight board, but I mean, that's something that I think is significantly down the road right now. As things are, at our last meeting, we were pulling statistics and reports and just really starting to get a look at the numbers, in regards to, police stops and, what race was the individual who was, pulled over for, incidences across, I mean, basically the whole of the town. So it's really data right now. I think that the idea of the oversight board would be to work with the police chief to tell him, or at least and also be able to go back to the community and figure out what the priorities are, what the town residents want to see, within the lens of equity. So we can research those numbers, let people know what we found, and then kind of get feedback and then bring it to the police chief so that he's not the only person who's kind of out there needing to stick his ear to the ground, as it were. Excuse me.
Thank you.
So just to be clear here, although you've included in here in a discussion about Essex Junction independence, it's not a oversight of the new city over the police department necessarily. It's a general, more general, I don't know, standard oversight committee that other municipalities may implement. And the request here is to have that the representation be equal from the town and the city.
Correct.
That's I think more the focus here. I guess the way I look at it is I don't know that I want to put together a contract that binds anybody with regard to how this, or the activities that this oversight committee takes on. I think that should come from the equity groups. And so I think I see this as the relevant piece of this is the representation that you're asking for. Should such a committee be developed in response to our equity activities? I'd be a little concerned about putting specific numbers on that because the equity folks may have a different thought about that. That's my only one other consideration there, but that's just a small detail that can be certainly worked out later.
Yep.
So, okay.
With you.
Can I move on to another topic? The Community Justice Center, we don't control their budget. They're an independent. So I think any responsibility there, you need to negotiate with them. There is funding that they get from the town, but their mission and so forth, we don't define, right? It's
they're primarily grant funded, well over $200,000. The town has provided
16 or 18.
20,000, not maybe 10% or less of what they get.
Right. So it's not something that we can say that you can have access to the Community Justice Center. You need to work through with them.
Mr. Chair, if I can
Right.
clarify something. About 90% of their existence is determined by the Department of Corrections. They do have some leeway beyond that if they want to and they have funding to do that. That is not from the Department of Corrections. So that's only one minor. So like if they wanted to do restorative justice and the town and the village thought that that was a good idea and was going to fund that activity, you could. And the Department of Corrections would be fine with that, as long as it didn't interfere with their grant and their priorities.
And the town has also talked about trying to increase the funding towards DJC in the coming years, just not knowing what's going to happen with the grant going forward. So
Yeah,
At
but
this
the-
point, it's not a ton, but it may change in the future.
And for alls that are here and listening at home, the state grant from the Department of Corrections has not increased in many years, but the employees who are town employees do get wage increases. So the amount that the town is paying for the CJC, not placing any value on it, is increasing while the grant stays flat.
Yeah, and the CJC's budget is included in the packet, the budget packet that we see, but we have no say in what that budget is. It's in there for informational purposes and for us to understand what our contribution, how much it provides. So I think you've included it here twice in this proposal, but I think you really need to work with the CJC for whatever support from them you're going to want.
I agree, and I think there, as I understand it, their jurisdiction is set by the Department of Corrections and the police. It's not really, they take people from other towns. They take people from Williston and Colchester or something like that. It's not a strict Essex Town, Essex Junction
And Milton.
organization.
Right. Go ahead, Tracy.
I have two questions for clarification, but since I keep hearing the Department of Corrections, I just want to make it known that I'm the IT manager for the Department of Corrections. I have no authority, input, or influence over the CJC grant, its funding, or the amount. So just to put that out there. So my two questions are around the police direct expenses. What exactly does that include? Does it include things like administration, finance support, HR, workers' comp, liability insurance, things like that?
I would say the things that are within the police department's budget. If you take a look at within the town's budget for the police department.
Okay. And my second question is, I'm curious about the rationale of why you're focusing on a percentage of the grand list as opposed to population. Just from my own personal comment, the grand list doesn't commit crimes. People do. So if you're talking about one apartment building, well, that's one on the grand list, but it may contain 150 families. It may contain 300 people. So I was just curious about your rationale there.
I'm trying to go quickly back to the memo from the police chief, as I believe that was his request.
Yeah, and the memo from the police chief did caution against going toward an incident-based split, and he recommended either a grand list split or a population split.
I think when we talked about it, we had discussed that the grand list is more stable than the population count. And so it was really to help with providing a fair amount of stability in budgeting, whereas with the population count, that can change, we believe, a little more drastically and significantly than what the grand list can change.
Okay, thanks.
To follow on more on that, you say through the budget. I'm not sure what that means. Does that suggest that the select board puts together a budget and you're going to pay 42% of it? Or is it, or I'm not sure what you've got an infinitely long contract here, which I'll ask a question about later. And you say through the budget, but how does that,
Just like now, where I watched a couple of the meetings, police chief in partnership with administration put together a budget. It's presented to the select board. If we've discussed so that it's paid for by the grand list, then the city would pay 42% of that.
so there's no contract that says it's X dollar amount per year with a inflation kicker on it kind of thing. It's you're willing to have the select board put any budget they want up, and as long as the town voters pass that budget, you're going to pay 42% of it. Is that the plan?
Well, in theory, with that, since we would have to pay, or since the city residents would pay a portion of it, the city would have to approve of the budget that we would put together for us to be able to have the funds to pay. But in essence, if the police department, police chief says we need 2 new officers, just as a hypothetical, then that would be in the budget and we pay 42% of it.
Okay. I had another point I was going to go on that one and I lost it. Maybe we'll come back.
I have a question about, I guess, kind of along those lines. What qualifies as in the budget? Obviously, police department makes sense. But we have Travis, who does HR, and police department is by far the largest department in the city. So that's a good chunk of his time that would need to be sort of, put towards that, but that doesn't fall within the police department budget. I think there's probably another couple of scenarios like IT. They do a significant amount of workload over at the police station, which doesn't fall within the police department budget. So there's a few, I think, I want to say, kickers, additions, just that wouldn't necessarily fall under that I think that we might need to address somehow.
I would imagine it would be something, it would make it more complicated, but I think it's doable to say, well, there's, what portion of town administrative time went towards police operations this year, and that gets rolled into the bill. Like that, you'd have to maybe cost that out into the police budget or something. I mean, obviously we're at still high level, but those kinds of details would have to be worked out. But
I'm just
that would
mentioning it
seem
now
legitimate.
because, I don't want
Right.
to surprise you guys with, when we're like, well, it's gonna also cost, X, Y, and Z.
But
No, what George's saying, that's what I was going to bring up. It would be difficult to parse out exactly how much of Travis's time was spent on that budget and to put a figure on that. So there are scenarios where I could see expenses for the police department increasing beyond budget. I mean, just thinking in my career back on, significant cases. I mean, things that really are taxing manpower, overtime, major cases that could potentially happen here within our community. And it could be within the city or within the town. And we just got to take that as, cost and divvy it up. I agree with this, as far as whatever cost is, and break it down by the grand list and we pay the portion, whether it's in the town outside the city or within the city, what have you. I mean, I don't really single out, say, well, that didn't happen here. We don't want to pay that extra. And I brought up, I think at the meeting last week, the things at the fairgrounds and stuff like that, events. There's going to be a lot of stuff obviously in the city that could be very costly or time-consuming, manpower and such.
Right. Yeah. What Dan was mentioning, that you've got an officer at 5 corners twice a day while the kids are walking through. That's not something that, right. If you're just paying 42% of the budget, then the town is paying 56% of that time. That's support. So there are some scenarios where we might need to think through a different way of handling or something. But I'm not suggesting we have that negotiation right here. But
and I get it, and you guys need time to digest this. But what I'm guessing is that maybe you'd put something in here in the contract where you'd say the funding and the parsing out of costs would be reviewed for the first few years to sort of compensate for these kinds of things. Suddenly there's something we didn't anticipate that's an additional cost that the town is getting more out of the contract than, there's an unfairness. So there would have to probably be some kind of review clause in the contract where we get to sort of rethink things if there's a real problem. So it's not just locked into one funding mechanism.
Well,
and then, like you said, if we discovered that there are police that are being paid in Essex Junction that are there that are not present in the town, and So we're getting a little bit more than our 42 or 43%. We're getting actually, we're paying 42%, but we're getting 45%, something like that. So it has to be.
One other comment. It's going to be difficult to, like George saying, to parse it out and see exactly the cost. But I know from experience that on certain situations, events like the fair or a special event that's going on, communities that I've worked in actually contract with the agency to pay specifically separate of a budget, make a contract, and it's private. That entity deals with it. So that could address special events. But as far as day in, day out, your normal crimes and God forbid, major crimes, homicides and such, that is catch as catch can. And to say that, well, because it happened here, you're going to have to pay majority of. I don't think we can. What happens when it happens in the city of Essex, Andy? Just for all of you, but it's a resident of the town that did it. Committed the crime. Where where do you draw the line here in these things? I just think we can just agree. I'd hope we could agree to say that generally we're looking at, basing this on the grand list, 42%, whatever percentage, however it sugars out, and we'll accept that. And then as far as the exceptionals, we'll deal with those. I think we can come to an agreement, hopefully, between communities.
Go ahead, Raj.
I think that's where doing it in the budget process and some of this, not having it can go both ways, but not having a set contract for a set fee that's for a set number of years, and then all of a sudden discovering that we need to make some changes. If it's in the budget process, some of those changes can be handled at the annual budget time when the budget's being developed. So if the town discovers that, well, we need to tweak this a little bit, then some of those discussions will naturally be held every year when the budget process is going. And that, I would imagine, would be also an ongoing conversation, therefore, with the city council, if between the select board and the city council, and how that's working out. If I'm not mistaken, the 4258 breakdown is kind of how it works now. And the officers at Five Corners, that's how the financial breakdown is working at this moment. So it's not a drastic change. Those officers are there for through traffic reasons because it's one of the busiest intersections in the state, and an awful lot of folks from Essex town, Jericho, Westford, you name it, are going to work through there. So that's part of the reason they're there. But anyway, I just wanted to make the point that, having a rock solid contract that's outside the budget that's just separately negotiated would probably make it more difficult to adjust as this went on, as opposed to doing it annually. Certainly pros and cons, but just wanted to add that.
So you don't have any heartburn about the fact that the select board's going to propose a budget, the town is going to vote on it, and you're going to pay 42% of the. You're going to have to charge your residents the amount of money to support 42% of that budget. So in a sense, the town is voting a tax for you. That's a way to look at that. So I don't know if there's any. How that works, whether it's a concern, and I'm just looking across at you because you're a convenient face.
I can speak personally. I would assume you would have the same motivation to keep your costs under control as everybody else. So that would be, it would affect the town just as much as it would affect the new city. So, unnecessary spending. So I would personally think that's okay. Yeah.
I'm not alleging that there'll be unnecessary spending. What my concern is that essentially the town is voting for a tax that the village will pay. In that scenario, the way I'm looking at it, and I don't know if that's legal. That's a question I think that would need to be asked. So that's where I'm. I'm not asking for a solution right now, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked.
In terms of seeking a solution, as the five of us have talked, okay, we proposed this. I knew what I was saying when I agreed to this, and I assume the other four trustees did too.
Okay, then the other piece of it is you've suggested no expiration date, and we've kind of been told that you can't bind future boards to a a contract of infinite length, and you have to do a shorter term, and I don't know what that shorter term is. So that's another potential legal question that would need to be looked at.
I think from a contract perspective, basically you would just have I'm not an attorney, but you would just have a clause that the agreement would auto renew every so many years unless terminated by either party, and that would give you, a set smaller term, but it just auto renews, so you don't have to do any work administratively in order to re-enter that agreement.
And hopefully we don't lose that document like we lost the last one that had one of those clauses in it. Yeah. So, all right.
I have one more thing. I'm kind of just concerned about like shared liability with the police department. So like if the police department is sued, the town taxpayers are on the hook for the legal fees of the police department. So I think that we should probably have some sort of discussion around that. Just try to like figure out what we can do. Go into it knowing, hey, these are the liabilities for the town, part of their police department.
One other question I have is you've got a comment in here about aligning ordinances. And I can't think of a scenario to represent this, but there's a possibility that you could enact an ordinance that costs a lot of money to enforce, or we could, but either, and so I have some small amount of, and I guess that's the case. It's the case anyway. In any case around this, sorry, I'm talking this through out loud, and I may talk myself out of it soon, but I know it's just something to think about. I'm pretty sure you don't want to be constrained by the select board saying, no, you can't have that ordinance because it costs too much. And so I don't know if there's a way to have some sort of assessment review, or maybe that's just some future reconciliation thing that happens if something is more expensive than you anticipate. So maybe
No, just to speak to what you're saying, Andy.
Yeah.
With under state statute, when I was working, if I stopped somebody on Route 15 here, I could write them under the state statute speed code. The revenues go to the state, whereas the municipal departments in the state they would write them under the local statute. So speed zones you could literally have an area on state routes where revenues could come from traffic fines to the community, being the city of Essex Junction or the town of Essex. Whereas if a trooper was out there stopping somebody, they might not write it under the code that would go to which we didn't always do that, but we could run it under state statute. So just one added thing. So we'd have to, I don't know how we divide up the revenues or the funds, whatever, but somehow it would be divvied up that way too, as well.
Couple of things that weren't mentioned here, but maybe they're just buried in part of the police budget that would be developed, is the Howard Center, the community outreach, and maybe the CJC falls into that same category, and maybe you don't need to do your own negotiations with them. We would just administer it and pass along as part of the police budget. So maybe I was out of that didn't need to be mentioned. Animal control also, I guess, would be fall into that same category. The event comment was made is, do we need to have some sort of individual agreement about events support? Okay, I think that hit all of my concerns in I already mentioned the oversight board, I think we need to have significant input from the equity groups before that gets totally defined. There are some questions around that I had around, we're going to start implementing stipends for some of our committees and whether we need to have agreement on that. But I think that's more administrative. How are we going to deal with joint communities or joint committees in the future? So, doesn't necessarily need to be a detail hammered out for this question.
Hands over here.
So, question for moving forward. There are expenses outside the police department budget that are in other budgets, like workers' comp and liability and other things. Sorry for there are items that are very expensive that are not inside the police budget that are in other budgets like finance, HR, IT, etc. How would you like the town to respond to this? Do you want to see a listing of those, of what the town would be responding to, as these are some of the costs that are definitely in the police department for that next discussion?
I think that with anything that is unresolved tonight, that the select board should come back to the trustees with a proposal for what you would like to see.
While we're on the discussion of the cost, so if we're going to parse everything, we can go down to the road of fire departments and say, how often does the fire truck go outside of the city up to the town for response? So the costs associated with that for services. So I think, I'm just saying that if we're going to look at the cost of things, it really you could look at a lot of things and try and break it down, and it
just
get very cloudy.
Yes, just so you know, I'm talking about major things like the bond for the building, the workers' comp, which is a very large ticket item, the casualty and property insurance for the police department is a very large number. Those three things alone are probably over $500,000.
Yeah,
That is not in the police department budget. They're in someone else's budget.
Don't you think you could look at your workers' comp bill and calculate what portion of it is for the police? So you'd have to. That's kind of what
the town has that.
Yeah,
per
you'd have to
department.
do that. So, I mean, you're probably doing that anyway already.
So I just want to know how you want to see it,
Right.
and so
like with the bond, what the second bullet is that the city acknowledge that there's continued payment of the bond.
Mhm. But it's also not in the police department budget. So when you say by the budget, it's not in there, it's in a different line item. So what I'm hearing is then put it in a proposal and show you the cost the town believes should be in that. And then you could discuss whether you're going to do it by grand list or any other metric.
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Raj.
No, just briefly, the only thing I'd say, not about the items that Evan mentioned, which are great, but delving into the HR and IT and all of that, certainly it'd be interesting to see what those percentages would be and if it would be possible to sort of shift that fringe over to the police budget. But this is also, this is a way to, this proposal, it keeps the police department intact, and it keeps, the future town, if this comes to pass, with a police department of the same size that it had before, with its full breadth and skill and resources to serve the town when needed. And same for the village or the city. So, one way to look at this is, this, if done by grand list or otherwise, and even if we don't end up rolling in some of those extra costs from IT and HR, for instance, this is a great way to keep that police department whole, like I said, and that availability for the future town, to have that amazing resource. So I just hope, I'm sure you'll all keep that in mind, but I just wanted to point that out. This preserves that.
Thanks, Raj. And Raj and Amber, since I don't have Teams open in front of my face the whole time, if your hand's up and I'm not getting to you, please just interrupt. and sorry in advance.
One thing that might make the teams work better for all of us is if those who are attending the meeting, if you're not speaking, you turn off your cameras so that we don't, that the view is easier on everybody. So Betsy, Don, or please turn off your camera so you're ready to speak. Thank you.
Was there other questions on the police proposal?
Look like it.
So the next one is bonding. And from this one, we would be looking for a moratorium on Town of Essex bonding votes through June 30, 2023, which I think we would actually want to amend to be through legislative approval of separation. And the rationale is, given the independence effort, we don't want to take on additional bonding debt that'll stay with the city afterwards.
Just to be clear, is this going to exclude the sewer departments, the water and sewer departments? Inclusive of those.
So the
from what I understand, they all, when we bond for those, they stay with their respective like service providers.
with our water and sewer being separate, then that wouldn't have an impact on the city. It's general fund.
General stuff.
General fund, capital fund, those things, non-enterprise funds. Good clarification.
My concern is that this ties our hands for an undetermined amount of time, and so it's a really hard thing for us to commit to. And I understand that's a bind for you, that if we bond and then the next year you're independent, how does that work? I don't know. This one's going to take some thought. Pat?
Yeah, I agree with you, Andy. Although I understand your reasoning, but I mean, as we've experienced, the GovOps can and does kick the can down the road. An indeterminate period of time. It could go down there, and might not see action on it for 3 or 4 years. And if something comes up where a bond vote is a necessity, I think it's unlikely, but I think in this case, having a specific date would make me feel more comfortable. Understanding your reasoning and where you're coming from. Just, I think relying on the legislature to provide that for us is touchy at best.
Yep.
Nothing new to add.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Next one.
Any comments for staff?
I think the caveat
Microphone.
that it does not include enterprise funds is appropriate. If anything's probably going to go wrong in an emergency, that's where it's probably going to go. And then my only other comment that I wrote in is that, two comments actually. General fund bonds are required to have voter approval. So that's one check on that. And then two, what they're going to get used for, and where. But other than that, it's not an unreasonable request.
Well, you've got, I mean, I'm just throwing a comment in there. You've got, generally speaking, in my experience with both governments, is we tend not to get too far into debt. And we've already got a significant bond out for the police with how many millions of dollars. I don't know off the top of my head, but you've got years to go on that and millions of dollars to pay. So it'd be uncharacteristic of the town of Essex, from my experience, the town of Essex I know, to take on another great big bond right now. But that being said, you never know what can happen. Something could happen. So, but yeah, I mean, as long as we understand the logic here, see what we're shooting for.
Ready to go on next one?
Yep.
We're doing public comment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The next one being transition period. The components are the transition period of July 1 to June 30, following approval of the charter by the legislature. That there'd be continued current consolidated services with work towards unraveling the administration, assessing, clerk treasurer, information technology, public works, and stormwater. Town would collect taxes for town and city for the budgets approved the previous March and April. City residents would continue to pay taxes but are no longer citizens of the town during that transition period. The rationales that the city will need to form so that the city budget and elections can take place with city only and town budget, and elections can take place with town outside the village only. City will need 1 year to prepare, and city voters will have approved the March budget and thus should pay taxes for that year.
So what makes you think that 1 year is enough?
What you're looking
it seems like a daunting task to accomplish all that. I mean, I think you've reading ahead to finance. You've allowed 5 years for finance. You know, why are these others easier? Or should we get some sort of assessment, or should you get some sort of assessment of how long it should take? And you know, the whole, you know, we still have a town to run in this year that you're asking for, and we're not going to put all our people through all kinds of overtime to meet a 1 year date for, you know, to there's implications for, you know, other work needs to be done, and for town staff to be doing work to support the city in this time frame without financial support from the city. I don't know. Is there a way to budget, you know, or to think about who pays for the transition costs? You know, especially given that we need to still run the town.
So I mean, with what we're in terms of the time frame, during that time period, one of the things that we would need to talk about as a board is we haven't created that budget yet. We have a little bit of some of this conversation is that we would budget in for a manager. We would budget in for some key staff to get them hired as soon as possible, so that way after this 1 year time period, it's not as if we need to hire everybody on one day, but rather we would have had this year where we've been hiring some staff periodically throughout the time.
I'm more talking about the word unraveling that you have in there, where you are going to need town support to train those new people you've hired. So this is the way that it's been done for the village, or are you just relying on them to say this is the way we're going to do it? It's a new way. You still have to transition. If there's any information that the town has that the city then needs to have, there needs to be migration paths. There needs to be, you know, all that support that you're going to need to transition from town support to city support is going to take town staff time. And for all of these departments, I have little confidence that we can do it in a year.
So what would happen though if a town person became a city person? Would the town then want the city to pay to train the new town person?
I don't know. I'm not asking. I'm not trying to negotiate it right here. I'm just raising the concern that I think a year is very, very aggressive to get all of that done. And the secondary or the auxiliary question, right, is if, you know, if this drives a boatload of overtime, which people won't like because we keep hearing that we're overstressing staff anyway. That's an expense as well. Just to meet an arbitrary 1 year timeline that I just think is very aggressive. And maybe somebody needs to, and I don't know. We've been asked not to do a lot of sizings either, so it's a tough to I have difficulty supporting a single year.
Yeah, and I think some of this is also we bring our own assumptions into this. Whether right or wrong are hard to disprove or prove at this point. So I don't think anything that any one of us are going to be able to say to alleviate any concerns that you have on it. We're not in that point. I'm not even sure what to say to it. Other than I hear what you're saying.
Don's got her hand up.
You also have included stormwater, and I thought our stormwater agreement was also with the town of Wilson. How do you plan on
It's wastewater.
wastewater?
Yeah.
But not stormwater. So, thank you. That answered my question.
Was just going to speak, if I could, to the department. So administration includes HR, and the plan for the village is to hire both their manager and HR director at the start of that year. So those two would be in place for an entire year. The assessing department, the board still need to discuss. The clerk treasurer has indicated that she could prepare everything to transition on July 1 after 1 year. And so she's prepared to make that happen. The trustees have discussed having an IT contractor. So they wouldn't need to hire an IT staff. Public Works is listed as a consolidated department, but I don't think it's actually materialized yet. And so I think that the village has its own Public Works department, which would be prepared to operate independently after a year. And the village also has its own stormwater coordinator. And so just that function wouldn't be shared anymore. So in terms of the services that would be consolidated for a year, I don't think they're going to pull on many departments. There would need to be a little bit, but I think the village would be hiring professionals to take and step into those roles. And so, yes, Travis would need to share with the new HR director how he manages, all the employees in Bamboo and that kind of stuff. But I think that new HR director, we would assume, would take on those roles and responsibilities. That's kind of been our discussions in terms of that timeline.
I just can add something real quick. The state requires the town and the village to work together on the MS4 permit, and that's not going to change. We're both responsible for the ultimate discharge into the Winooski River. What we do and everything, but I think that we would absolutely have to continue some kind of stormwater, joint stormwater oversight and coordination of our activities. So that's going to continue, but it would take some adjustment.
Is separating the clerk that in that 1 year, does that include all of the land records and all of the paper records that exist?
No. So the records that exist before the city is incorporated would stay with the town. Once day one of the city happens, that's when the records would be stored from the city side. So all the historical stuff, if somebody wanted to do a land record search, would ultimately have to go to two places at some point.
So, if I can, so you got to envision this. There's a book, and you today a house in the town refinances, and that's 101 goes into sheet 101. Then 5 minutes later, a house in the village refinances, and it's 102. It goes in the same book. So I guess the concept is great. It's in a book. It's in a record digitally, and it sits in the vault here. From day one of the new city, that transaction of the city property getting refinanced would be city number 1 in the book, and city number 2 and city number 3. But anything that is done in the town would have to come here and fill the town's book. If somebody is doing a title search for a property that's in the city, they are going to have to go to two places. Potentially, if if it's far enough back.
So just to be clear, only new records would go into the city's vault. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, so existing, okay, we wouldn't have to go through and sort through. Okay, that's very helpful to understand that. Thank you. Yes.
There's
that
a
was,
lot of other things.
That was a big concern of mine. Is like,
there's a
who's
lot
gonna
of
pay
other
for
things that
filtering
are-
all those out. Yeah.
Is it a
There's a
bad
lot
time
of
to
other
talk about
things that are gonna have to
record
get-
digitization?
Great time.
Yeah. I think IT is not going to be as easy as just hiring a consultant, and because there's going to be a lot of hand holding there of moving data and so forth. But maybe it can happen in a year. I don't know. My other question is the last bullet in the top section there says city residents pay town taxes but are no longer citizens of the town. Is it? I'm not sure I understand what this period is then. So is this the, I guess maybe the right way to ask this is, I think, won't the legislature tell you when you're no longer a citizen of the town? And could they say, well, it has to be on June 30 or July 1 of the following year after this transition year, or I don't know what the.
If they want to do something other than what we propose, they could. The thought that we've had going through this is, just for argument's sake, to make, I think, the math or the timeline easier, let's just say July 1, 2023 is the date that the city is incorporated. But yet, we as village residents will have voted on the town's budget that would be in place July 1, 2023.
Yeah.
What we're saying is, even though as of July 1, 2023, we would not actually be residents of the town as a separate village, as a separate city, we would recognize that we would still pay the taxes as we were voting for those taxes. We're voting for that budget.
So from a timeline perspective, you're saying that if sometime in April the legislature approves this and agrees that July 1 of that calendar year you can become a city, even though you've already approved a town budget, that's the scenario you're suggesting? And you don't think that they're going to say, you've already approved your town budget, you need to stay, they might, who knows?
We don't know.
Yeah. Right. So that's where I'm this is not something that I can commit to say, yes, you're not going to no longer be a town resident. And I guess we'll have to see how the scenario plays out. Cause the way I might suggest is that if in April your charter is approved, I think it should be for the following July, not the July that's coming up immediately. And in parallel, we ask the legislature to generate or to create a temporary town voting district that's outside the village that votes on the following year's budget, so that only people who live outside of your new city vote on that budget, which becomes effective July 1st, the same day that you become a new city. So I think that's, I like that idea a lot better, where, that's what you're proposing is a scenario where village residents will vote on a town budget that they're not going to be members of for that full year. Whereas I would like to go the other way and say, okay, in parallel with them approving your charter, they also approve a provision that makes the town outside the village a unique voting district that can vote on a budget that impacts that entity after you've separated.
Would like to make that proposal.
Yes, but we haven't talked about it, and so
Yep.
that's yeah, right.
And that's going to be a train that you would have to drive. Unintended.
We'd have to figure out how that might work, or whether it might work, whether it's legal, whether it's possible. Right. I also have to ask the rest of the board whether they would support that sort of scenario.
And you'd also need to know what constraints the Gov Ops committee might put on.
Yeah,
something.
yeah. There could be
Don't know.
many other, right. Whether they could have a completely different view of the whole thing than I do. As may these other 4 other people in the room.
Good to go to
I just think I think you're right. We're speaking the same language. It's just a matter of how we get there, right? The point is that the village voters don't vote the next March for the budget. That only the town outside the village pays for, right? We're both sides, or what you're saying is That's what you want to accomplish, right?
But they will have voted on a budget that doesn't affect them the
Right.
prior year. That's why I'd rather see it go the other way. But again, that's just me talking.
And for the trustees, they'll have to, this is written into the charter, and so I think the tricky part for the trustees would be writing something like that in that's dependent on something else also happening in terms of the formation of a
Right.
tax district.
Right.
Whereas this approach kills two birds with one stone and accomplishes the same thing, that they're still paying taxes and that they don't get to vote on the next one. Would be my only comment.
Anybody else? Okay, going to the next one. Reappraisal fund.
Any
Nope. The reappraisal fund. The city will have paid its share of reappraisal funds that have been collected for village properties by the town. City and town would agree to do a joint RFP for reappraisal, assuming both will need to be done at the same time. Rationale is that the town has collected $8.50 per parcel per year as money from the state for reappraisal for village properties. The village has about 3,400 properties out of the 8,200 in all the town. Account balance is over 800,000.
Go. We haven't talked about how to do or whether, I mean, we the select board has offered the trustees the opportunity or the possibility of going through this next reappraisal with the town's assessor, which is I guess the other question coming back to the prior one where assessor is included in there. If the upcoming likely reappraisal is 3 years out, it's beyond your 1 year, possibly beyond your 1 year horizon. Is there should there be more discussion about that possibility before something like this is agreed to? I guess is the
What is that possibility?
well, if the alternative way to do this is for the city to contract with the town to do their reappraisal, we would hold the money, and then at the end of the reappraisal, then we would potentially distribute any leftover funds, rather than doing it up front and then asking for it back if we're going to contract together. An alternate, it's a different way of looking. In the end, it may end up the same.
I also had the same thought. It seems as though it would be less resource intensive to do it that way, as opposed to, transferring everything first and then, we have to get back together again, develop a joint RFP and go down that path. It was just my initial thought when I was reading through it.
Anything else?
I don't. Just to clarify, so the funds are here. We do get them from the state. We do not get them for every parcel. I don't know the ones that we don't get. I'm sure we don't get for municipal parcels. I'm sure we don't get them for the state parcels that are in your community or anything like that. But in general, we do get $8.50 on a preponderance. That money exists. It is set for revaluation. Right now, we are hearing within the next 3 years, we're probably going to be made to do so. The state spent a lot of effort in the school district to get our, I think the term is CLA,
Yes.
to be equalize between the town and the village. So I strongly suggest you go through the revaluation, if assuming it's in with the next 3 years. The town runs that revaluation through a service, which we would do the RFP. We could even discuss that process of approving that firm that does it. We are hearing those costs are roughly $100 to $110 a parcel. And then whatever's left over in the fund, the boards can decide what they're going to do with it, on what basis they would share the remainder. But it is, at least in my opinion, money that was given per parcel. It's a finite amount that is set by the state, and by the way, has not changed in, I don't want to say forever, but it's at least the last 8 to 10 years that amount has not changed. So it's not like you say the village grew this or the town grew that. It's been the same for a decade. So I would just suggest if you want to see a counter from the town, then the town would probably counter with something like that. Other than that, it will also be very confusing to people of who they're supposed to call and where they're supposed to. So, but if that's it, sure. One quick question. The confusion of reappraisal versus tax billing. If the town is not doing this, who is also doing the tax billing for the new city? Is the city going to do its own tax billing?
which the town clerk does now, right? So
For both.
Right, city clerk.
For both the city and education taxes.
The city clerk would function as the city's clerk and do whatever the clerk needs to do. In terms of the school tax, I don't know. It's something that we would need to specifically iron out.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
The school district currently pays the town to collect taxes, correct? The school district does not collect its own taxes. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that's a pretty big contract, correct?
Yes. And the town makes the school district whole as they do the village.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a point that I will say we haven't discussed how that would work, because if Essex Junction has its own clerk, Essex Town has its own clerk, what's the school district going to do? Is it going to divide those two things up because it doesn't recognize the school districts, the town being separate from the village school district anymore. It just recognizes one school district. So this is something we'll have to discuss. And not a big deal, but it's a technicality that will have to be worked out.
I'm making an assumption that when the city clerk would send out a tax bill for the municipal taxes, it would then add the extra line for the education tax, just as like what the town clerk does now. And I would then assume that we would make the school district whole for the city portions, just as the town does now. It's just, instead of asking the town to now bill a set of taxes to properties that it doesn't have on its own grant list, doesn't have any control over or know the assessment value of, we would just take that portion on, and the school district get 3 checks, one from the town, one from the city, and one from Westford.
Yeah.
But those are all assumptions. Next one being senior services. That when we are talking about senior services, it is including the senior center at 2 Lincoln Street, senior bus service, and general senior programming. Please use it as a caveat, as a senior program. That's what we're talking about. That Essex Parks and Rec would provide the management and oversight. all related revenues deposited in town-managed senior services enterprise funds, and funds used for direct senior services related expenses. Reserved fund from the Essex Area Senior Center would be transferred to the town and used for the intended senior center expenses. All direct expenses related to senior services would be shared equally by the city and the town. The town bills the city at the end of the year for actual expenses. The city would provide senior center space at 2 Lincoln Street for drop-in hours and senior programming, other times available for city municipal use. Portion of city annual budget or annual buildings expense associated with senior space is assessed and reduced from 50% of the town bill. That senior services advisory committee would have, similar to the police department, would have 3 city and 3 town representatives appointed by the respective boards. The board would be staffed by the EPR program director of senior services. Rationale being that senior services have been shared and it has been working. That EPR has a history of managing these services and has done so well. Way of splitting up the responsibilities of senior services and tree farm between both communities. So it's referring to the tree farm proposal coming up soon.
So I don't understand the next to last bullet. I don't even know what those words mean.
The EPR's history or the
Portion of city annual buildings expense associated with center space is assessed and reduced from 50% town bill. What does that mean? I don't.
The bill from the town for those services. So how the city would pay for half of senior services bill. What we're saying is that 2 Lincoln, which would be owned by the city,
Mhm.
that the costs associated with that building and having the services available there would be shared. So that amount that it would cost would just come off of the bill. Instead of the
Oh,
town
I see.
billing the city for the services and the city billing the town for the building.
So you're essentially proposing the same thing here. The thing here is similar to what you are for the police services, that it would be a budget would be put together and it would be, it doesn't say here that whether it would be shared by grand list, but it's because now I hear it saying equally and 50%.
We're just saying 50%.
Okay.
We realize that there are seniors who attend from outside of the town and city, but that is just something that philosophically both communities have wanted to provide in the past, and that we would like to be partners in that philosophy.
So I was accosted in the parking lot of Price Chopper yesterday by somebody, by an irate bridge player, unhappy about the fact that they don't have access to the senior center anymore.
It's a big deal.
And so the question I have here, though, there's no comment here about, you know, it says drop in hours, but who decides those hours? And because it's your building and our program director. Right? So is that something that needs to be detailed out in contract, or is it?
I don't think we want to detail out the hours itself, but how that is arrived at. Do you want to put something up? You all want to talk something on paper?
Just curious about the utilization rate of the space. Is it 100%, 75%, 50% utilization just for senior services as opposed to other uses? I don't know.
Pre-COVID, if we look at it pre-COVID, please correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, it was 100% senior services.
Okay.
And I think the intention is to have it 100% senior services. Right now, we're going through some transition stuff, but the idea is to get it back to the way it was.
Yeah, and I see the third bullet from the bottom in components. The last part of that is other times available for city municipal use. That's the reason why I'm asking that question, because it seems like it's not anticipated to be 100%.
And so overwhelmingly, I shouldn't say 100%, maybe 98, somewhere around that realm. And the reason I say it is I know that there were legislative forums that happened in that space. There was one capital committee meeting 3 or so years ago that we needed an overflow room, so we used the senior center at one point when the seniors weren't there. Can't think of anything else, Brad, but it's overwhelmingly
It
for
has
senior
been.
services.
I think your description of pre-COVID, it was 100% that senior space was just utilized for senior programming, and I think the center needs to reopen and reestablish its hours and its programming. I think there's we have a conversation scheduled, I think, next week about, Allie and I and Nicole have talked just about probably needing to change that space actually could be available when it's not being used by seniors, that it could serve other municipal uses. And so I do think that this contract, should reflect that it would be for the time that it's being used for seniors. I think would be appropriate. Yeah.
Pat, you were shaking your head at one point of a comment. Was there anything you
I
wanted to
mean,
add?
the senior center does get used for some after-school programming as well.
It did for the first time last year during COVID when we couldn't be in the school, but that's
That's
wouldn't be a
or is that
normal-
over now, or at
Yeah,
least the plan is that?
that's not a normal use. Yeah.
If I could. So, as we all probably know, meeting space is at a premium. I mean, not even a premium. We don't have any. Like this room and the village boardroom is the only, and maybe occasionally Memorial Hall are the only places the village or the town have flexible meeting space. Occasionally 75 Maple, but it's a catch as catch can. And I guess the question is that the sort of the idea, there are nights, there's weekends where the seniors don't have hours. And the city wants use of that space.
Yeah. Correct. I mean, there are AA groups, there are religious groups, there are all sorts of groups that are looking for space that don't charge their members, and that space sometimes could be a space that would accommodate those groups well.
Just for clarification, who's paying for that space? In this iteration, is there any rent or any electricity, or is that the village's contribution, or is that something that's also shared?
So a portion of city annual buildings expenses associated with center space is assessed and reduced from by 50% from how much we would pay the town. So a portion of it would be paid out of that contract.
It's going to be nominal at best. If you look at the overall expenses of 2 Lincoln and figure out what percentage of space the senior center takes, I think it's more on principle that if we're going to share everything, all the costs, then let's be honest about what those costs are. My best guess is it doesn't get to double digits in terms of thousands of dollars.
I don't disagree. I don't. Yep. I don't think we track it at all.
No.
Either way, it was never a big deal to begin with. I just wanted to understand.
Other questions on this one? This one, similar lines, tree farm. So if you philosophically just flip it, where senior services would be provided from EPR, this time tree farm would be managed and overseen by EJRP for the tree farm services. Now all related revenues would be deposited in the city managed tree farm enterprise fund. Funds would be used for direct tree farm related expenses. That direct expense of 50% of the program director, sports and fitness salary and benefits related to the tree farm time would be shared equally between the city and the town. The city would bill the town at the end of the year for the actual expenses. There would be a tree farm advisory committee made up of user groups that would jointly be approved by both the city council and the select board. Membership would be based on group representation and not residency. And I'll get that one back in a moment. City council and select board would both pass common ordinances of this property. Rationale being that the EJRP has a program director of sports and fitness who could take on this work, and it's a way of splitting up the responsibilities of senior services and the tree farm between both communities. And back to that advisory committee, it's conceived of being the soccer organization in the area, the rugby organization, the various sports and entities that are currently in the future using that property would be a part of it. And not necessarily just a 3 residents from each community.
And to clarify for folks that may be listening at home or in the room, this is the tree farm is a jointly owned facility currently managed by the Tree Farm Management Group, which is an independent organization. That may or may not be the case in the future, but it is a jointly owned piece of property.
Good clarification that it's within both communities.
And it's not that the town owns the town portion of it and the village owns the village portion.
No,
We
that's right.
both
It's jointly
jointly own the entire thing.
Right.
Although there may be clauses about if we ever decide not to, I don't know.
I think the only clause would be, Andy, if someone wanted to, if we wanted to build something there, then you'd have to say which planning commission, which development office, and which planning commission reviews the application.
Right, and
It would depend on where it falls on the town village line.
Yeah,
Other than that, it's jointly owned.
this plays into the last line here where it says common ordinances. I think it's in the town outside the village you can't build an indoor recreation facility, but within the village you can, right? So those are already not common ordinances, right? Or are they zoning? Are they ordinances or are they?
It's zoning in the town and land development code in the village.
Yeah, so it's, I guess, not technically an ordinance, but it is a difference in that. And so I don't know if your intent then is to have to that level things be common. I don't know.
I think
Something we can talk about, I guess.
Liken it more along the lines of like shooting.
Right. Yeah. Firearms discharge. Yeah. I would be in it. Makes sense to have for that to be common.
Not allowed at the tree farm. Just
right. Currently
Let's
not
clear
allowed
that right up.
in either side.
And currently no dogs.
So you mentioned in this one that there would be an actual billing at the end of a year, rather than having it be a budgetary thing like some of the other scenarios we've talked about. That billing at the end of the year makes it difficult. I don't know how we would budget for that.
If I could comment, I think the intent with all of them is that they would be in the budget at the beginning of the year, but actually billed at the end of the year, because what actually goes into the budget doesn't always equate to what the actual expenses. So I think the intent is everybody budgets for them, but you're only paying actual expenses.
If we use the example of the employees there for the entire year,
Mm-hmm.
then half of that employee would be billed. If there's a gap in the employment for a period of time, you wouldn't be billed for time that a person wasn't being paid.
Okay, so that any underspent money, okay, okay. So any underspending, the fund balance associated with that would go to both communities equally, rather than accumulating in this account. That's the intent on this one.
I would say same for all of them. Same with police. You know, they would put.
It didn't say that on the other one.
It-
That's why I
it
was
didn't.
asking that question. It didn't say that.
No, I think it's a great clarification. I think
Yeah.
I would treat them all the same. Same with finance. Same with senior services.
What happens if expenses are more than in any of these scenarios? So that's where this is. I'm concerned that point wasn't made clear on the bigger ticket items we were talking about earlier. That the intent is to have a reconciliation at the end of the year. Currently, our highway agreement has that in there, and we've never done it. Okay, we'll have to think about that one.
Yeah.
I was going to say it would be, I'm looking at Tree Farm, Senior Police, and I think that this may be what you're getting at, but it would be nice to develop some sort of methodology that's scalable enough where you can apply it to IT, HR support for police, the sports facility or sports and fitness program director for Tree Farm, for staff supporting the senior center, so that we're only developing one methodology rather than a methodology per individual contract. Does that make sense?
So about like the indirect cost type thing?
I'm sorry?
With regards to like indirect costs? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
And I'm going to have to excuse myself. I have to take an early evening here.
No worries.
My apologies to everyone.
George, before you leave, can you bring me one of those bottles of water over there?
Sure.
As long as you're up. Thank you. I forgot my water bottle.
Make that 2.
There's a... right.
For a brief.
George, I'd like one too.
Okay. I'll take some orders.
Thank you,
Is there a
George.
Is there a delivery charge involved?
You've only got 2. That one bar.
So on this one, the one, oh,
Have a good one, George.
thank you. Thank you so much. You explicitly list that only the program director is the program director is the only direct expense. Is that really your intention? Because there's surely going to be IT costs associated with scheduling and those kind of things. Is that maybe I'm
I think it's similar to the other departments. We didn't include any of the indirect. So HR, IT, any of the supports like that. Other questions? Board members? Okay.
so we're halfway through our list of 12 items, or is it 11 items?
We are halfway through.
And it's almost 8:30. Do we want to keep going, or do we want to? How do folks feel?
I say we've got a rhythm going.
These other ones have been shorter, so okay. Anybody okay with keeping going? All right.
Finance. City would contract financial services from the town. City and town would each employ 2 full-time personnel. Town would employ the finance director and assistant director. The city and town would share the salary and benefit costs of the director and assistant director by a percentage of the grant list. City manager and town manager jointly hire, supervise, and evaluate the finance director. Town would bill the city at the end of the year for actual costs of the director and the assistant director. Would expire on June 30, 4 years after the city is formed. Rationale is that the finance director has indicated that time is needed to separate finances.
Any questions?
Yeah, I may have misread Sarah's memo, but I thought she mentioned an extra FTE and how that would work in. I thought she said 3 and 3 for staff.
She said she had 6.
Yeah, so I spoke with Sarah on that. So there would be 2 village employees, 2 town employees, and then the 2 shared employees. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
One thing I have concerns about is going into a contract with you that restricts how many people we can hire. Because this specifically says we can only hire 2 people, or continue to employ 2 people if we decide we need a third, or a half a person, or I'm if we're gonna, is this another one where we're going to budget and then figure out how to divide it, or just we're all paying for our own employees and they're working together to separate things? Is that?
So the 2 kind of questions there. One of the 2 people is really just in line with Sarah's memo and Sarah's thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to align with that. Where that came from. And then your second part was about the cost, how that's shared.
Yeah.
So town can, or so employing them with the thought that they're going to be separating stuff out. That's what the question is, right? Having these 6 people work together to pull it apart.
So in other departments, you said we just select board sets a budget, town approves it, you're going to pay 42% of it or whatever the grand list division is. That's not said here. So I'm just asking what's the intent? I mean, it almost looks like we're going to have our employees, you're going to have your employees, and they're going to work together, and we'll just pay for our own employees, and there's no other costs considered.
So city would have to, the town would hire would be the employee or the employer for the finance director and the assistant director. And then we would pay for half of those costs. Or, I'm sorry, we would pay for the salary and benefit costs by the percentage of the grant list.
Oh, it is in there. Percentage of the grand list is there.
Fourth.
Okay, so this is another one where maybe we need to look at IT support and so forth because the finance folks use computers, right?
Abacus.
Yeah, just gonna say that. And
Same.
for each department, 1 abacus.
So I guess I am, yeah, right. This is you're trying to limit how many people we hire. I don't know because you've got explicit number of people that we're allowed to employ in finance. Is concerning that you're trying to constrain us.
Please don't take it as that. It's not the intent of this is not to say you can only employ 2 people.
Good evening.
The intent of
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President
Got it.
That's great.
Watergate affair. These include charges of.
So the intent of it is that Sarah's memo has said that there should be 6 people. That's all that it's from. If the verbiage changes to not more than, or I'm sorry, not fewer than. Yeah, we're not trying to.
Okay.
Prevent you from hiring 9 people.
And sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have had extensive conversations with Sarah, so I feel like I can represent. So right now there are 5 in the finance department.
Yep.
One of them is a village employee.
Yep.
And so she's
We'll talk
talking
about
about
her in a
bringing
second.
on another employee. And what we talked about is if she brought it on as a town employee, we know within 4 years, if everything happens, that person would no longer have a job in 4 years, and somebody would then need to apply for a village job. So she thought it was cleanest to hire and establish 2 village employees for the long term, hire and establish 2 long-term town employees, and then at the end of the day, her and Courtney, who are currently the department head and the assistant, 1 in theory would go to the village and 1 to the town, and that would be decided at a later date. Rather than have 5 town employees and then the village needing to hire 2.
Go ahead.
Only speaking for myself here, but I want to ask the question in case it hasn't been asked. What are yours, meaning trustee, thoughts about departments where I know you've proposed a separation ending after a period of time, but we've heard from Sarah that she thinks that finance could be stronger together in perpetuity. Now, obviously, we're in theory doing that with the police department, but would the trustees be at all amenable if the select board came back with a counter proposal that might include a long-term continuation of finance, or is that a non-starter?
No. Thanks.
This gets a little confusing because part of what finance does supports the police department too. So then we're shifting from one department to another department potentially, but you're already paying for that other department. So we'll have to think through where it makes sense. But you can't have one without the other. Yeah. Okay. Just a thought about how messy this
We
might
had
be.
that discussion the other day.
You have a comment in here about the city manager and town manager jointly hiring the finance director. Similarly to the police chief, that seems like it could be problematic. having two bosses. Is a requirement.
Rules anything you want.
Yeah, right, okay.
Could I just clarify why that's different than police? The police chief would be providing police services to to both communities. The finance director would be leading the finances of two separate communities. So that's the difference. Is she would be responsible for managing all of the books and the assets and the audits for the city, as well as responsible for doing all of those things for the town. Whereas the chief of police is not going to have any requirements to do anything for the city other than provide the services.
The other thing that I could see being a little odd in this is when it says city manager and town manager jointly hire, there's somebody in that seat. And when I'm saying this, I am not at all suggesting nor trying to imply that that person should have to reapply for their job, nor be rehired. That would, I would say, just be there of if that person decides to no longer be in that position during this time period.
We could propose some language. I think if you're amenable to, we could propose language to address if a vacancy occurs, how a hiring. If it, yeah, sorry, it's been a long day. If a vacancy were to occur, we can address language of how a vacancy would be filled with both city and town input, and some type of hiring and supervision. I too have talked to Sarah. She's not going to take too kindly to anybody supervising her about her work. I'm kidding. She's wonderful, but
Gotta follow the rules. Yeah.
gotta follow the rules. Hers.
Other questions on that?
Nope.
One is funds. The important components being the town currently has 4.9 million in assigned fund balance. The city is not asking for any sharing of that. At the end of fiscal year 20, the town had just under 2.3 million in unassigned fund balance, which is capped at 15% of general fund operating budget. Village taxpayers contributed 42%. When the city is formed, the town would pay the city $965,953 spread over 5 years. FY 21, 22, and 23, 42% of any town surplus before it is assigned would be assigned and distributed to the village/city. Amounts that village taxpayers have contributed to the unassigned fund balance.
Couple questions. What happens if there's a negative balance? There's an overspend rather than a surplus. If it's a negative number rather than a positive number, something we need to think about. Another is that the town budget is not going to decrease by 42%. And so the purpose of that unassigned fund balance is an emergency fund. I do not know if the village has one of those at this point. And so if we were to if we were to start handing over cash out of that fund, that brings us below 15%. That puts us at some risk. there's reasons why we have that 15%. And it would play funny things with what the surplus actually is, because we'd have to be feeding back into our 15%. So there may be that almost $1 million you're asking for. Could put a hole in our 15% that we worked hard to develop. And yeah, I understand that village residents as town residents contributed to it. But so we'll have to think about. I think we need to consider that and potentially look at scenarios. I don't know. I'm concerned about handing over that much, given what's the unassigned purpose of the unassigned balance is.
This is a fiscal year 23 budget. Important components being that we would like to redo the town and the village manager MOU to reflect current and anticipated administrations. Work towards a greater tax equity in the return of the village's portion of money paid to the town for services that do not serve village residents. Return 42% of town capital taxes to the village/city. Return 42% of town community development budget to the village/city. Rationale that town and village manager MOU doesn't factor in other administration related positions and functions, which will also change with hiring of the city manager and city HR director. The village pays money for town services and departments that the village already has and do not serve village residents.
So which services are you not getting?
Development.
I would argue that any development that happens outside the village mitigates your town taxes, and so you are getting benefit from.
Would you say that the town is benefiting from village community development?
That's actually a rub, and that's exactly the rub as I see it. Right, is that the town outside the village benefits from the village community development department without paying for it. Absolutely.
Same with fire department, parks and rec.
Yep.
That's the rationale.
And so, but you're saying it as if there are services that we provide that you don't get, rather than there are services you provide that we don't pay for. That's a different way of looking at it. And I'm just concerned that there seems to be some opinion that there are a lot of things that the town does that do not support the village, and I think it's a limited number, and it's not as big as many people make it out to be, and I just the language here I think could be clearer on that regard. That's why I've asked a number of times, exactly what those services are, so we can go and look and say, well, what do they cost?
Or maybe a proposal of the village bills the town for the services that are provided that the town benefits from. Kind of what you're saying.
Or we, well, I guess I'm not now that I'm. So this is talking about the upcoming year's budget. And so what are you proposing here, that we continue to move, as an example, I think it's something that has been posed before, move the village fire department into the town budget in 2020 or the FY23 budget, as an example. Just I'm not saying that's what we're going to do, just an example. Is that what you're talking about, or is this what do you ask? I don't understand what you're asking for here, I guess.
So if you look at pick the town capital budget, Or let's pick the town
That's
community
that's a
development department.
separate thing here, though, isn't it? Or do we have
Uh,
a page for
The town
capital?
capital taxes are the second part of that last bullet.
They're in here. Okay.
But let's just pick the community development budget. I think that one might be cleaner. What we're saying on here is that the current village is paying 42% because of the grant list for that budget. And so what we're saying is take 42% of that budget and write that as a check to the village.
Oh, that's not how I read this at all. You just want a refund.
So I was thinking of that 'cause I'm imagining going to like Home Depot and asking for a refund. Sorry.
That's why I think it needs to be clear which services you're talking about, because we have no idea how big this bill is that you're thinking you need to get.
So I would say capital taxes, the community development department. Would you like us to?
I'm not saying we need to talk about it right now,
Yeah.
but I think
mean,
I think the community needs to know.
To get the exact
what-
numbers, Andy, though, you're going to have to, it'll take some work to figure it
Yeah,
out.
yeah. I'm not asking for the numbers. I'm asking for what are the services that.
Well, like Andrew's saying, I mean, community development, the capital budget itself, and just capital costs. The capital costs within the village are covered by village taxpayers. The capital costs in the town outside of the village are covered by the town as a whole, including village. So so that's what we're talking about. So go ahead, Greg.
I think if the boards do continue this discussion, it's more complicated than just 42%. ComDev's come up a few times now, and just in the past year and a half, and I know it hasn't always been this much, but town ComDev has provided some services to the village. The Juneteenth event, working on the fees update, working on the cannabis, work around cannabis, and village ComDev is contributing to those things as well. My point being just that it can get tricky and complicated in terms of the actual dollar values and who's paying what and providing what. Parks and Rec, I don't know if that would be considered one of those services. The town maintains a lot of parks that are open and used by everybody in the community. So I just think it's going to be a hard, difficult conversation, complicated conversation as you go forward down this road to consider.
So to speak to what you're saying, my issue is the potential liability, capital liability. The capital liability for the village is the capital within our community. Road washes out in the village is on the hook. Road washes out in the town, paved, unpaved, whatever. The village is on the hook, and the town as a whole is on the hook, including the village. So I'm saying we carry potential liability and capital costs that the people that live outside the village don't realize. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And capital, is it just a straight 42%? Is there a way to update the capital plan and put some projects that are in the village? Big conversation.
Yeah.
My big point is it's a big
It is.
conversation.
Yep.
Yep.
Could I ask for clarification? I'm sorry.
No.
Could I ask for clarification on the first bullet under the rationale, because the discussion that we're having doesn't jive with how I'm reading that first bullet, so it would be helpful just to have you speak it out for me, please.
So under the important components about redoing the town and village manager MOU to reflect the current and anticipated administrations. And what that second bullet is talking about is we would be looking to then hire a city manager and city HR director, and as such, we would need less services from the jointly unified manager. So we would be looking to redo that contract.
I guess where I'm sort of going in my brain with that explanation is I don't think it's just going to be as of a date certain. Oh, we have a city manager and that person is going to hit the ground running. Boom, they're off. And then the unified manager, town manager at that point would just sort of turn and walk away. That there would still be collaboration, or which scenario do you see happening?
So I'd be operating under an assumption right now, so I just want to name that. my assumption is that when the city would hire a city manager, there may be some initial collaboration, but we're looking to hire a city manager to be an independent city manager, just as when any community hires a manager to independently manage. They may need some peer support from time to time, as many of us do when we need it, but that it would be an independent person.
That makes it clear. Thank you.
Are you limiting the ask to these two specific items only for FY23? For example, capital and comp dev. Yeah. Are those the only two, or are there other ones you're asking about but just didn't type or put in here? I just want to get a clarification about.
Those were the only two that were put in here, but no, it's the that sentence beforehand, to work towards a greater tax equity for the portion of money paid to the town for services that do not serve the village residents. So as an example, those are two.
Okay.
Those are examples. Right.
Could I just, some clarification? I think, in looking back at the MOUs, the original MOU for the consolidated manager happened way back in 2013. At the time, there wasn't an HR director. At the time, Darby's position was 30 hours a week, and Darby only did village work. So things have changed a lot. Darby's replacement, Tammy, is full-time. Tammy serves both the village and town equally, but she's 80% paid for by the village. Linda is the administrative assistant. She serves both communities equally, and she's 100% paid for out of the village. Travis is, serves both communities, and he's 100% paid for out of the town budget. The village pays for 50% of the manager's salary and not the benefits, but then also pays 42% of the other 50% of the benefit of his salary. So I don't think it was anybody's fault or there wasn't any malintent behind it. I don't think the current MOU that the two boards have accurately reflects the actual administration and who and how they serve.
Questions for board?
Just to clarify something Brad said, I don't mean to be too nitpicky, but yes, things have changed. Tammy was not a Darby replacement. Tammy was here before Darby left. It's been between a bunch of turnover. That's the way it shook out. I don't want anyone to think that anybody was a replacement of any one position.
The next. This one being assets. Important components being that town currently has nearly $29 million in capital assets net of any debt, and that the city is not asking for the sharing of any of those. Town government continues at 81 Main for not more than 5 years after the charter passes the legislature, and this is based on the trustees' assumption that the select board will not want the government center to be within another municipality. That the city and town would agree to an independent appraisal and sale of the building. The city has the right of first refusal to buy it at 58% of the appraised value. Rationale being it is very confusing to residents of both municipalities to have town government in another municipality. That the city residents would still go to 81 Main, town would still go to transact government business in another municipality.
I don't think this is the city's problem to solve, and you have no say in when we sell this building or where we have our offices. So I think strike this one.
As she said, we have to share the records. Makes it easier for the people to go from the village, Lincoln Hall, to 81 Main for sharing records.
Municipalities can absolutely own property in other municipalities. South Burlington can't tell Burlington to get out of the airport in 5 years, right?
Although sometimes I think they wish they could.
I think they'd like to, maybe, but yeah.
They would like to.
I think the intent was, do you have any questions or comments, and then you'll put together a response to this.
I think the no was heard.
He's just polite.
he's
Ed,
just
but-
one member.
But do you have?
board.
I'm just one member of the board. I'm just one member of the board. And maybe I'm spilling my guts too soon.
I have no question.
I think you do have a one good point. There's a lot of confusing things, and so ultimately, I think certain points may be something for the select board to discuss for a future counter proposal, and not to go against what you just said, sir, but maybe just get some other inputs moving forward about the future of this building. Should the town have a reason to move out of this building? I would hate to pay a broker to sell to someone we already know may want it, and work on that as well. And the fact that both the village and the town have been served well by administration in this building, whether it be clerk or finance, manager, assessor, etc. etc.
It's a bit self-aggrandizing, isn't it?
I put manager like third, sir. Did I? Third? Second? I'll go with clerk. Clerk first.
Nope, not for me.
Next one, the last of the prioritized one, no, second to last. Last of the prioritized is Indian Brook access. City residents would indefinitely wish to be considered resident pass holders. Now, the village has contributed to the Indian Brook Dam and water control and should continue to have access to seasonal passes. I would also just note that it came to the trustees' attention that the word grandfathered comes from a place that is not intended, and as such would not use that word again in this venue. So I would apologize if we were offending anybody by that use.
Just for a point of clarification, going forward, if the dam does need more work or there's more water control or treatments needed, would the city be amenable to sharing those costs? Let's try to feel the room.
I hear you.
Yeah, who do you want any say in like the structuring of Indian Brook or anything like that?
Not intended. Your counter proposal. Seems like you were going to pass.
I need to think about it for a little bit.
Cool. Also looking over at
Comments?
Amber and Raj, as I have neglected the screen lately, so I'm really sorry again. Great. Right. Last one, tax delinquencies. This one came after we had prioritized things, so this is somewhere between 1 through 12. I would likely say it is not 1. The important component being that the village tax delinquencies incurred through the conclusion of the transition period until the city begins collecting its own taxes would remain due to the town. You can see Sarah's ration.
There'll be a counter proposal. I won't divulge it now.
Worries.
Or there'll be discussion of a counter. I don't get to make that call.
Is there any questions, comments?
Not about this one, but I do have a question about things that weren't included here. You had originally proposed Parks and Rec, and we had expressed concern or interest in some aspects of it. That's not here, so I guess we can, I don't know if we make a counter proposal, or is there a reason that Parks and Rec was not included in any of these pages?
We were not interested in a short term.
So maybe we'll flesh out what we were thinking. Come back to you.
Good.
Other things that were not included is Green Mountain Transit. Get this train station over here that has a bus coming to it. Town pays for that service now.
So just like Winooski, Burlington, other municipalities, the city would pay for what the city wants out of.
So you may need to have a vote whether or not you join Green Mountain Transit, right? You're got all that thought about, okay. Their charter specifically lists the people who are allowed to be in that. And I don't know if if there's an umbrella that
Colchester
allows you.
not in it. They're not.
Yeah.
They don't pay.
Well, neither is the city of Essex Junction isn't
Right,
in their list
right.
of allowed. So,
Yep.
Okay, there needs to be discussion there. Similarly with Winooski Valley Park District, whether you want to be a member of that or not. Essex Rescue, they're a per capita. Okay, you know that too. Health officer wasn't mentioned. You're gonna just have your own health officer. I don't know if, I guess cannabis isn't necessarily related to separation, but the vote needs to happen before you separate, right? So I guess that's a different discussion we need to have, not associated with this. But it could be associated with local option tax, but I don't know, again, that's a separation question or just a potential new revenue question. Or if they need to be worked into the separation discussion somehow.
About a local option tax or cannabis?
I often in my own mind link the two because if there's a local option tax, there may be more incentive to approve cannabis, right?
Anytime you want to talk about local
Yeah.
option tax, you know I'm willing.
Right.
I've said this for
right.
years.
Right, but I'm just trying to think of the separation income. I think the complexities of establishing local options tax are the same whether we separate or not. I know that I've said this out loud, so I resolved that own question myself. Sorry for the time it took me to say that.
No apology needed, Andy.
Some people don't like it when I do that.
We all have our own processes of how things work. Let's
Yeah,
verbalize.
yeah.
Are there others? Seem like Tracy.
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to make sure, Andy.
Yeah, I'm spent.
Okay. So just sort of housekeeping, do you have a preference for or against receiving sort of package proposals or counter proposals, or should we assume that each of these stand on their own?
You should assume that each of them stand on their own. Sorry, I had to recall our earlier conversations. So were there other items that were not included you wanted to discuss?
I think it gives us a good starting point.
Can I ask Tracy to elaborate on that question?
So in negotiations, if you want to take, part of, and I'm just throwing out numbers here, but if you want to take part or all of proposal 1 and combine bits and pieces of maybe proposal 3 and say, this is our counter proposal, but you have to accept both parts. Does that make more sense?
It does. I just wanted to make sure I was getting what you were saying. Thanks.
Yeah, an example might be access to Indian Brook and trade for something, right? Is that what you're, something that's not necessarily specifically associated with Indian Brook?
It allows for that flexibility to sort of mix and match from proposals and put them together as one counter proposal or proposal on its own.
Great, got it.
And I guess if we're not talking about the proposals anymore, I do have another sort of housekeeping-ish item. Just for both boards to think about whether you would be interested in going into, in my world, we call it supposals. So just in open session saying, would you be willing to, but not have that be binding until the process is completely done. So it just allows for brainstorming back and forth without the fear that anything is going to, be binding until the entire package is complete.
We're very familiar with those in the union negotiation world. Maybe a few too many proposals.
See some eye twitching.
Yeah.
You love it.
Just back to housekeeping. I
Yep.
think you said you would open up to the public at some point, and then I would maybe suggest that if the select board or boards want to go into executive session or whatever, I have 2 rooms set up. I have the conference room up at the top of the stairs, and then I have my office. I brought up chairs. Those are the 2 private places that will have enough room for 6 or 7 people. So I just let you know that at least those are the 2 rooms available, and you can not hear from the other room unless you are absolutely screaming, which I recommend you don't.
So before we go to the public comment, if we could go to the next steps and kind of process from here portion. So I know that one of our next agenda items, or our next agenda item, is to talk about the July 26th meeting. I'm not trying to get to that agenda building, rather just to make sure we're all on the same page. I want us to be on the same page as to what we do next. So what would be great is if the select board were able to have a list for the next meeting, so for July 26th, regarding proposals. There are things that you would agree to, suggested changes, questions, so on and so forth that we would need to discuss. If there are things that you straight off the top agree to, that would be great to know, because at that point things can go to the attorneys, they can draft that up, we can just start the voting process. If there are things that we need to further discuss, then that would allow for July 26th to be that discussion. So from the trustees, that would be our desired next step.
So yeah, so as Evan alluded to, we will go into executive session and have a discussion about these items, and I don't know that we'll resolve any of them. So I don't know how to explicitly say what we can have available to you at the next meeting. It's not like, I mean, we don't have a meeting between this meeting and that meeting. And so we're in a tight spot. I mean, it's I don't want to now kick off a select board meeting that includes public comment, but all of that on these topics. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to talk about how we want to.
The other thing I would suggest is with the next agenda item being, because one of the requests from the select board was that we talk about the next agenda item before we end this meeting.
Right.
So what we could do is, I know this was a request from the select board. The select board would be okay. We could not have that conversation tonight and rather take the rest of the time tonight for you as a select board to meet either an executive session or open, does deal with contracts, that's your choice. And if you meet in executive session, you can come out with that list for the 26th. You would have that time. And then the agenda for the 26th would be to further the conversation. I think we need to know that portion before we end this conversation to go to the next agenda item or to not go to
I think we need to go to the next agenda item in order to make a decision on this agenda.
Well, but
I mean, a detailed decision. I mean, I don't think that the select board, at least I don't feel comfortable setting an agenda and saying, oh yes, let's have a meeting without going through the process of executive session or further discussion on these topics. I think if we do find that we're ready to have a joint meeting next week, that there's only just one agenda item, further discussion of the proposals. And I think we're fine leaving it at that.
And so the mechanics of that would be we'd go into executive session. If we made that decision, we'd come back out of executive session and we would state publicly whether or not we're ready to have a meeting on the 26th. So that's a, I don't know how that sits with the trustees. You know, 'cause I have no idea how long this executive session will take either. If you want to be present for that discussion, because you know one of the I don't know how you want to do that.
I think I can say with confidence that we have it on our agenda, or we have it on our schedules to meet. If you want to have that meeting, we're there. If you don't, it's okay. I don't think we need to wait around for your executive session to end to have that conversation. Does it sound like we're ready to go to public comment to end this agenda item? Yep. I just saw Raj nod his head too.
And thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Also.
Nice, thank you. So from here, we would go ahead and take public comment on all of this wonderful conversation you just heard. Why don't we start with Microsoft Teams, and then we will come back into the room. So if you're using Microsoft Teams and wanted to speak to the boards about what you just heard, please go ahead and raise your hand or type into the chat feature. Please expect to only speak once. If I need to, we can limit the time. Please address your comments to Andy and I, and please don't have the back and forth among residents. If you agree with what somebody else has said, please just say I agree, so that way we can move on. So I see Betsy Dunn. Your hand is up.
I want to say that the trustees for this meeting, the trustees have come armed. They've been working on these proposals for quite some time, and they have just said that they want this decision to be done and completed by tonight, basically, so you can come back tomorrow or next week to have this conversation. I think that's ludicrous. You have to think about what these things are, and they've given you 3 hours as a review of these things, and you're supposed to have an answer for them tonight. This is nuts. I believe these negotiations on the components, none of which are important to the contract for their charter change for a city of the town of Essex Junction, are required. So this stuff doesn't have to happen right now. And these components should be considered and negotiated when the separation has passed the legislature, which may not be this coming year, because they're going to be working on the reapportionments of the towns and the district redistricting. You may not even get this through the legislature this next session. And we need to have our representatives, the 5 from the town outside of the village, sitting across from the trustees who are all from the village and negotiating these very things. I think we shouldn't be looking at this, but I will say with the police, when you talk about events, you can hire out for that and have people from different districts in the state who want to work that and be police officers. They are ready police officers in their own towns, and hire them in as subcontractors. You don't have to use our own police force. And the no bonding, you're talking about us giving up our offices that we own, telling us we have to sell them. Then what? Do we have to build a new facility? Bonding. But we're stuck with the bonding because you said we can't do any bonding. I think this is flawed. I think that we need to really have a long look at all of these things, but I do think we shouldn't be getting an answer and telling you what we will do unless we have the people and the separation has been voted and it has been accepted by the people of the village and the legislature has approved of it. Thank you very much.
Mary Post, your hand's up. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering, it seems to me that before tonight, there was a lot of talk about forums. And Greg had talked at another meeting about wanting to know what the people think. And it seems like a lot of things are happening here without really any input from the people, except people like us that are on this meeting tonight. And it just again makes me think like there's a lot of verbiage coming from everybody saying we want to know what the people think, but you're just really not asking for it or getting it. One little example that came up for me that might possibly be an issue, I don't know, is maybe we don't want to share a senior center anymore. I think someone mentioned tonight that some of the people in Essex say they can't get down to the junction. Maybe the town would want to have its own senior center. I don't know, but I just think that the public is really not getting a chance to weigh in on this. So why are we, if we still are, spending money for forums? I mean, it just seems like it's a sideline that's going to be shelved again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Anybody else on Teams, please raise your hand or type into the chat feature. Irene, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Irene, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are you able to hear me?
Irene, we can't hear you.
Sound very distant.
How's that? Is that better?
Yes, it is.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much for your patience. I agree with Betsy that this feels rushed. I agree with Mary that the public should be part and parcel of this conversation. For those of you who are not part of the renovation process, a small fortune was spent on renovating 81 Main Street, including a fireproof and a flood-proof vault for land records. To repeat that in another building in another location would be foolish. The town should continue to own that building as long as possible. But my main comment has to do with Indian Brook access. A lot of money has been spent some years to eradicate invasive species. There will be a lot of money spent on the dam. And if the village would like to continue to be season pass holders, I think there'd be nothing wrong with asking village residents to fully fund their share of the use of Indian Brook Reservoir. And I think that's pretty easy to look at statistics as to who owns passes and who hasn't in the past and determine, I'm guessing it's probably 50-50, but, maybe it's even 60-40 as to who uses that. But usage in the past and payment toward past repairs or past eradication of invasives has nothing to do with the future expenses there. So I would insist that if the village wants to be season pass holders, they add that into their budget, a contribution that's fair and equitable to their usage and to the needs of maintaining Indian Brook, which is, as we all know, really heavily used and very popular. Thanks.
I'm seeing no other hands up on Microsoft Teams. So last call. No other hands, nothing in the chat, so we will go off of Microsoft Teams and come into the room here. If there's anybody here physically with us who would like to speak to the boards about what you've just heard, can you raise your hand so I can see? Okay, go ahead, Patty.
You all are doing great. I'm hearing you this time, and you're doing a great job. So, I want to say, being a Saxon Hill person, people come from all over, and to me, Saxon Hill is Indian Brook because that's where I go. The procedure for adopting a policy versus an ordinance, by the way, when you were talking about the police, regarding ordinances, a statute granting only enabling authority means the municipality must first adopt an ordinance pursuant to 24 VSA 1972, blah, 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 before it can exercise control over the matter. We need an ordinance at Saxon Hill, and we need consequences governed by our police force that needs to be in the police budget. We have 11,600 of us in the town outside the village, but everybody else comes from everywhere to use Saxon Hill. We need signs on the gate that say, leash your dogs when you're on a public road. We need this enforcement.
Saxon Hill wasn't a part of our conversation tonight.
Saxon Hill, let me say, well, the reason I'm telling you about this ordinance, I looked it up while you were talking about policing, and an ordinance is not too expensive for the town outside the village. It is needed, besides our sidewalks being plowed, that our old people use every day and cannot walk on. Thank you.
Ken?
I know there's a lot of inertia here, inertia to come to an agreement. A lot of pressure, short deadline. Nevertheless, I asked the select board to consider alternatives to a negotiated agreement. Make sure that you are taking into account what might be better than the negotiated agreement. Senior Center is a very good example. Possibly better arrangement there might be not to include that in the agreement and simply go our own way. I hope that you do that for each of the considerations. It's not only important for the select board to consider its alternative to a negotiated agreement, but also your counterparty's alternative. It may not be positive, and it may help you come to a better negotiated agreement. That's basically it. It's called Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. BATNA, you can look it up. It's a negotiating mechanism. I urge the select board, I expect my select board to consider that. Sometimes the solution might be, don't make a deal. Go your own way. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing as there's no other hands, we had no votes.
Oh, right. So I think we already talked about the discussion about whether to hold a joint board meeting. The trustees had asked us to add these additional 3 meetings, and select board, we had talked about the conditions around that, and we really wanted to close what the budget would be in the meeting prior, and we already talked about the fact that we don't know what that's going to be until after we have our executive session, because we don't know if we're going to be ready to have more conversations or whether we need to wait until we have our own scheduled meeting or get public input or whatever we end up talking about. So I'm not sure we can close this until after that executive session. I think the trustees have given their position that you're willing to have it, and it depends on our decision whether we're ready.
If I can, there's one thing I want to add to that.
Yep.
So along those lines, one of the reasons why I had asked for these meetings is, even with these meetings, if we look at the overall timeline, and I'm sorry I'm having terrible eye contact, but I wrote this down, so I just want to make sure I don't get the dates wrong. After today, we have July 26th, we have August 23rd, we have September 20th, and September 27th. Those are the 4 meetings that we have left together until we as the Board of Trustees need to have our charter and transition periods solidified to go out to vote. So that's why we've asked for these meetings. If we take one away, that just means that there is less time for trying to come to some level of agreement, which will certainly put things in a bit of a bind. So that's why we've asked for these meetings. I appreciate your willingness to have them, and hope that we can get through this as expediently as possible. If you'll remember, when we went through the merger process, we had both the charter and the transition periods and transitional items part of that charter to be voted upon. And so we will need to do that again. We need your help, and hope we can come to that conclusion or come to that consensus.
I can't guarantee we can meet your timeline. So yeah, we one of the items in the reading file, or is it in the consent agenda, is discussion about when our public forums will be, and the last one is August 21st.
Yep.
So that's something we'll have to discuss as well. What that means to us.
Yes, and in there, get the memos language right. I thought the language was in there that I am not seeing, so never mind. Are we good with that?
So yeah, I think unless there's, I don't know, any other comments from select board members about the agenda for next meeting, I think we covered adequately.
Yep, I think so. If the trustees are willing to meet, then the decision is up to us after executive session.
Yep.
So make it that.
And we removed 6D, so consent agenda.
Would the trustees like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Raj. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? 0.
Select board motion to approve consent agenda.
I move the select board approves the consent agenda.
Second.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Don. Any further discussion? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0. Okay, moving on to the reading file. Any board member comments? Either board? Okay, and that brings us to any.
Just wanted to mention, if you don't mind, today, many of us went to St. Albans and then to the village about the Vermonter being back in service. It was a good day. We got to see a lot of our state elected officials and talk to them about the train station here in Essex Junction and its need to be renovated. And so there was a lot of people in attendance, and we got a lot of very good FaceTime with Senator Mazza, Senator Chinden, Lieutenant Governor Gray. Correct. Thanks. It's late. And several other people from Amtrak and otherwise. So it was well done, and they were appreciative that we were there and that we gave them time and information. We are probably on the news tonight if we ever get to the 10 o'clock news.
Could you just express our thanks to Tammy for all her hard work on that?
Absolutely. She did a great job, as did Robin. Did a tour of the downtown, and several others, and thank you to Essex Junction Rec for the use of your tents, because it came in handy today with the rain. But thanks. So thank you for the time.
Thanks, Evan. Okay, and I guess this brings us to executive session. Select board's going to want to go. I don't know if the trustees will or not.
I think we're all set.
You're all set?
Good.
Okay.
Me too.
So we need to find the correct set of,
While we do that, since we're not going to go into executive session, not to be rude, we'll just adjourn.
you could do that.
The trustees adjourn.
I think Raj seconded that. Although I see Kathy's hand up. Is that about that motion to adjourn, Kathy?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Thanks.
So the motion's on the table. Any further discussion on adjourning from the trustees? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Anybody opposed? Okay, so that passed 4-0. Thank you, Select Board.
So Kathy, what is your question?
Have a good night.
Good seeing you.
Kathy, you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we have a plan for getting the motions afterward to me. So just putting that out there. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see.
I have it right here, Andy, if you want.
You've got it. It's 6B1. Is that the correct one? There's two motions, is that right?
To discuss contracts, premature knowledge, and the second one to enter into
Yep.
executive
Okay.
session.
All right. Go ahead, Tracy.
I move that the select board make the specific finding that premature general public knowledge of the town's position concerning the proposed contract discussion would place the town at a substantial disadvantage.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Do you have a second?
I'll second that.
Thanks, Vince. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, next motion.
I move that the select board enter into executive session to discuss potential contracts pursuant to 1 VSA 313A1A to include the unified manager, deputy manager, assistant manager, town attorney. Should I have included the assistant manager or just?
Yeah, you got it right.
Okay.
Okay, second. Thank you, Don. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right. So we will go into executive session upstairs in the little conference.